But one constant that we see everywhere when we see the set of assumptions that really drive effective scaling, and this is Brad Bird, who is the Academy Award-winning director of the incredible Ratatouille. They have something that you see at Pixar. And in fact, I'm going to show the slide at Pixar on Monday and see if they agree with me. He has what he calls this relentless restlessness, this feeling that nothing is ever quite good enough. And when he told us about this, it was actually he was explaining why he got fired by Disney. Because he worked there in the Disney animation studios at a point where they had hit mediocrity. And he knew, if you know about Disney history, they call them the 8 old men who did movies like Dumbo and Snow White and all that. And he said those guys were never satisfied with their work. And I had bosses who were complacent and would say, I think what we're doing is pretty good. And he said, once you hear that attitude, it's all over. And if you look at Facebook, you look at Pixar, you look at David Kelly, for those who had him yesterday, we're just talking about David Kelly doing next big thing management. This notion that kind of a restlessness to always push things just a little bit further is a hallmark of effective mindsets. Okay, enough of that. So this is a rough sort of view of the agenda. Let's go into the lessons. The other big lesson, or I guess the first big lesson, is when you look at organizations that are good at sort of propelling a mindset. Of course, it's wonderful if the boss tells you to do something and everybody marches, but that's actually a pretty effective way to management. It's much more powerful when there's this sense of mutual ownership, that feeling that I own the place and the place owns me. Certainly the most effective professional service firms I've ever been around, McKinsey, when it works, is like that. They're having a little problems lately. If you know, they have a little bit of scandals, but for the most part, an organization with a history where people really have that feeling that I own the place and the place owns me, and people create this feeling of mutual obligation. A good example that we like was that a consortium of U.S. hospitals studied the problem of why in some hospitals, typical U.S. hospital, when you've got somebody who is usually actually brain dead and they have organs to donate, what's the difference between hospitals that will harvest the organs, say, 50% of the time versus the very small percentage of hospitals that get over 75%? And the hallmark was, when they actually studied those hospitals, there was constant mutual obligation and constant attention to making sure that we all work together, all teach, all learn, huddle several times a day to talk about what's going on with the patient and his or her family. And one thing that's important here is it wasn't just the doctors and the nurses. It was everybody they could reasonably have involved, clergy, the receptionists. Sometimes they'd bring in families who had gone through a similar decision. So this feeling of sort of mutual obligation is a really important sense. And the other thing you get here is scaling, once again, is not something that just comes down from the top. It's this thing that happens. It's sort of a social process where everybody pushes everybody else.